The old man had been sitting in that car for 22 minutes before she came through the door. He almost didn't recognize her, not because she'd changed, but because of the way she was carrying herself. Like someone who had learned a long time ago to take up as little space as possible. One bag over her shoulder, a hard-sided suitcase rolling behind her, except the left wheel was broken so it dragged. Scraped concrete with every step. He'd worked for Raymond Whitfield for 11 years before Raymond disappeared from the world. And for 18 years after that, Curtis Webb had been waiting for one specific morning. This was it. She reached the end of the driveway, stopped, looked back at the house once, just once, and he saw her jaw tighten and go still. She didn't cry. She didn't go back. She just stood there like she was saying goodbye to a version of herself that had believed these people were capable of something better. Curtis stepped out of the car. "Miss Whitfield," he said. She went very still. No one had called her that in years. Victor had made sure of it. "Your father asked me to find you." He paused. "He said you'd be the one they threw out first." "What time is it where you are right now? Drop your time and your country in the comments." I was 6 years old the first time I watched my father negotiate a contract. I didn't know that's what it was at the time. I just knew we were in his office on a Saturday morning, which meant I got to sit in the big leather chair behind his desk while he stood at the window talking to two men in suits. The office smelled like cedar and coffee and something I couldn't name then, but would later recognize as the particular scent of a room where serious decisions get made. He didn't send me out. He didn't lower his voice. He just let me sit there, spinning slow circles in that chair while he held his ground on numbers I didn't understand. Afterward, he bought me a waffle from the place on Peachtree that put too much powdered sugar on everything. And I asked him why he didn't just agree with the men so we could leave faster. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Aubrey, the moment you let someone rush you out of a room that's yours, you've already lost the room." I thought about that a lot growing up. I think about it even more now. My name is Aubrey Whitfield. I'm 34 years old and I'm a licensed architect based in Atlanta. I have a firm I built from nothing, 2 employees, a rented office on the East Side, and a reputation I constructed carefully over 10 years of doing exactly what I said I would do on time, under budget, without cutting corners. I am not a person who falls apart. I learned early that falling apart was a luxury I couldn't afford. My father's name was Raymond Whitfield. I say was because that's what I was told, that he died in a car accident on I-285 on a Thursday evening in October 18 years ago when I was 16 years old. Victor identified the body. Victor handled the funeral arrangements. Victor stood beside my mother at the graveside in a charcoal suit and held her hand while she wept. And 3 months later, he moved into our house. And 8 months after that, they were married. I want to be precise about the timeline because precision matters. I've learned that the people who want to take things from you are counting on you to be too grief-stricken, too young, too trusting to pay attention to the timeline. I was all 3 of those things. I was 16 and I had just lost my father and I did not pay attention. My mother was a good woman. I need to say that clearly. Eleanor Whitfield, Eleanor Carr. After the remarriage, though she never fully made the switch on anything that mattered, was warm and generous and deeply loyal to the people she loved. She was also, in the years after my father's death, profoundly lost. Victor found her in that lostness. I used to think he loved her. I spent a long time constructing that belief because the alternative, that he had targeted her specifically, that he had moved close to our family before my father even died, was a thought I wasn't ready to hold. I'm ready now. My mother passed 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed late, moved fast. She left me everything she had, the house on Cascade Road, a portfolio of small investments, and a letter she'd written by hand that I've read so many times the paper has gone soft at the folds. In the letter, She told me she was proud of me. She told me to trust my instincts. And she told me in a line I didn't fully understand until recently, that there were things about our family she hadn't been allowed to explain, but that she hoped one day I would find my way to the truth on my own. I didn't know what she meant. I filed it under grief, the kind of thing people say when they're dying, and the morphine is making the edges of things soft. I know what she meant now. After her death, Victor remained in the house. There was no legal reason for him to leave, or so he told me, and I was too consumed with my own grief and with keeping my firm alive through a slow quarter to fight it immediately. He had always been civil to me, cool but civil, the kind of stepfather who never forgot your birthday, but also never once asked you a question that required a real answer. I had learned to exist in the same rooms as him, the way you learn to exist alongside something unpleasant, but not immediately dangerous. You keep your distance. You stay polite. You don't turn your back. What I did not do, and this is the thing I have to live with, was look closely enough at the paperwork. 3 weeks ago, Victor called me into the living room of my mother's house, the house she left to me, and sat across from me with a manila folder on the coffee table between us. He was wearing that gold signet ring he always wore, turning it slowly on his finger, the way he did when he was about to say something he'd already decided couldn't be argued with. He told me there had been a legal complication with the title transfer on the house. He said it calmly, the way you'd describe a minor inconvenience. A snafu, nothing to worry about. His attorneys were handling it. I asked to see the documents. He said they were still being prepared. I asked which firm. He named one I'd never heard of. That night, I sat in my car in the parking garage beneath my office building for 40 minutes, not moving, just thinking. My mother had used the same estate attorney for 20 years, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had an office in Buckhead and answered her own phone. The firm Victor named was not Patricia Osei. I called Patricia the next morning. She told me she had been contacted 3 months after my mother's death by Victor's representatives, who informed her that the family had decided to consolidate legal matters under new counsel. She had not heard from me because she assumed I was aware of the change. I was not aware of the change. I went back to the house that afternoon with a specific question and a recorder running in my jacket pocket. I found Victor and Renee in the dining room with a stack of documents between them and a pen in Renee's hand, and my mother's name on a line she would never have signed. I stood in the doorway. Neither of them heard me come in. On the top page in the upper right corner was a handwritten note in Victor's handwriting. I only caught 4 words before Renee looked up and saw me. 4 words were enough. Transfer complete by Friday. I have always been good at reading rooms. It is an occupational hazard of architecture. You walk into a space, and before you've said a word to anyone, you've already cataloged. The light source is identified, the load-bearing walls noted which corners have been neglected, and which surfaces have been maintained for appearance rather than function. You understand instinctively that a building tells you everything about the people who designed it and everything about the people who've been living in it since. What they value, what they're hiding, where the pressure has been building for years without a visible crack. I should have read the house on Cascade Road more carefully. I had been walking through it my whole life without actually seeing it. Let me go back 3 weeks before I found Victor and Renee in the dining room. Before the manila folder and the signet ring, and the name of a law firm I'd never heard of. There was a Tuesday morning in early October that I've returned to many times since, because I think that was the moment something shifted, not in Victor's behavior, but in my ability to see it. I had stopped by the house to pick up a box of my mother's architecture books. She'd had a collection she was proud of, mostly mid-century modernists. A few Ghanaian designers she'd tracked down at estate sales over the years. And I'd promised myself I'd bring them to my office before the end of the year. I had a key. I let myself in through the side door the way I always did, and I stood in the kitchen for a moment before I realized Victor was already home. He was in my mother's study on the phone. The door was half open. I wasn't trying to listen. I was looking for a box from the hall closet, but the house was quiet in that particular way. Old houses get quiet in October, and his voice carried. He was talking about a property. A commercial property, I gathered from the numbers, something with a square footage I associated with a mid-sized office building rather than residential. He was describing an accelerated timeline. He used the phrase, "before the estate is fully settled," twice in less than a minute. And both times his voice dropped slightly, the way you drop your voice when you're saying something that would sound different to a stranger than it's meant to sound. I stood very still in the hallway. Then he said a name. He said, "Raymond's people won't be a problem. I handled that a long time ago." I told myself I'd misheard. I was good at telling myself things like that. I'd had years of practice. I picked up my box of books and left through the side door and sat in my car for 10 minutes before I could make myself drive. By the time I reached my office, I'd constructed 3 separate explanations for what I'd heard, each one more reasonable than the last. And I had chosen the most reasonable one and put it at the front of my mind where I wouldn't have to look at the others. Raymond was a common name. Victor had known other men named Raymond. It meant nothing. I believed that for exactly 19 days. The first crack appeared not in a conversation or a document, but in a photograph. I had been sorting through a second box of my mother's things, the box from her bedside table, the one I'd been avoiding, because it was the most personal. And near the bottom, beneath a rosary she never used and a broken watch she never threw away, I found a birthday card. My 16th birthday. My father had given it to me 3 weeks before he died. I knew the card. I remembered it. What I did not remember, what I could not explain, was why the card was in my mother's bedside drawer, rather than in the box of my own childhood things I'd taken from the house years ago. I opened it. His handwriting inside blue ink, slightly rushed the way his handwriting always was, when he was writing something that mattered to him. The message I remembered. But at the very bottom of the card below his signature, there was a line I had no memory of. 4 words written smaller than the rest, like an afterthought or a precaution. "Check the Savannah account." I stared at those 4 words for a long time. I had never known my father to have an account in Savannah. He was an Atlanta man, born here, built here, intended to die here. We had no family in Savannah. No property, no business, no connection to the city that I'd ever been told about. I turned the card over, held it up to the light, looked for anything else. There was nothing. Just those 4 words in smaller handwriting than the rest, written with a different pen. The ink slightly darker, slightly newer. He had gone back and added that line after he wrote the rest of the card. He had written it, knowing something was coming. I put the card in my bag. I did not tell anyone. I went back to my office, and I pulled up every piece of financial documentation I could access relating to my mother's estate, the documents Patricia Osei had prepared before Victor replaced her, the account summaries my mother had included in a folder she left me with her personal papers. I was looking for anything with a Savannah connection. An account number, a routing number, a property address, a name. I found nothing. Which I have learned is itself a kind of information. Whatever my father had been trying to tell me, someone had made sure the trail was clean. That same evening, I drove past the house on Cascade Road and noticed a car I didn't recognize parked across the street. A dark blue sedan, idling, no plates, visible from the angle I was driving. It was gone by the time I circled the block. I told myself it was nothing. I was wrong about that too. 2 days later, I found Victor and Renee in the dining room, with my mother's name on a document she never signed. 2 days after that, he called me into the living room with a manila folder and a story about legal complications. And 1 week after that, at 6:47 in the morning, I walked out of that house with a broken suitcase and the birthday card in my bag. and 4 words I still didn't fully understand. The dark blue sedan was parked at the curb. This time, an old man got out of it. Curtis Webb drove like a man who had learned that silence was a form of respect. He didn't explain himself when I got into the car. He didn't ask if I was all right. He just waited until I had closed the door and set the broken suitcase on the seat beside me, and stared straight ahead for 30 seconds without speaking. And then he pulled away from the curb at a steady, unhurried speed, like we had somewhere specific to be, and enough time to get there with dignity. I had gotten into a stranger's car at 6:47 in the morning with a broken suitcase and a birthday card from a dead man. I want to acknowledge how that sounds. I want to acknowledge that every reasonable instinct I possessed told me this was not a decision a careful person would make. But he had called me Miss Whitfield, and he had known before I came through that door that I would be the one they threw out first. There are things you can't fake. The particular weight of a name said by someone who knew you before you had to earn it, that's one of them. We drove south on I-75 for a while before he spoke. "I worked for your father from the time you were 5 years old until the night of the accident," Curtis said. He kept his eyes on the road. "I drove him to the hospital that night, not because he was injured." He paused. "Because he needed to disappear, and we had about 4 hours to do it before Victor filed the paperwork." I heard everything he said. I processed none of it. "I need you to say that again," I told him. He said it again. Same words, same even tone, the way a person speaks when they've rehearsed something for a very long time and have made peace with how it's going to land. My father had not died on I-285 on a Thursday evening in October. There had been a car, his car registered in his name, found at the bottom of an embankment off exit 44. There had been a body not his, a fact that Victor and a physician named Dr. Leonard Pruitt had between them ensured would never surface in the official record. There had been paperwork. There had been a funeral with a closed casket because the damage from the accident, Victor explained to my mother and to me, had made an open casket inappropriate. My mother had believed him. She was 39 years old, and she had just been told her husband was dead. And she believed the man who was telling her because he had been her husband's business partner for 7 years. And she had no reason yet to understand what Victor Carr was capable of. I had believed him because I was 16 and I was destroyed, and the idea that someone would manufacture the death of my father was so far outside the architecture of my understanding that I had no framework to hold it. "Why?" I said. It came out smaller than I intended. Curtis was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your father's company, the land holdings. There were 11 properties in the portfolio at the time. Commercial real estate, mostly 2 of them in development corridors that are now worth 12 times what they were worth then. Victor had been a minority partner, 20%. He wanted the whole thing." He glanced at me briefly in the rearview mirror. "Your father found out. Victor knew he'd found out, and your father made a choice." "What choice?" "He decided that dying was safer than fighting." Curtis said it without judgment, the way you state a fact about weather. "Victor had already made contact with people your father didn't want anywhere near you or your mother. Disappearing, actually disappearing, not just legally, was the only option that took you both off the table." I looked out the window. We were past the city now, the skyline shrinking behind us, and the landscape was opening up into the long, flat stretches of central Georgia brown fields and tree lines and the occasional water tower with a town name painted on it in letters I didn't bother reading. "He's been in Savannah," I said, "outside of it. A property he purchased under a different name through a series of shell companies before everything went wrong. Victor never found it." Curtis paused. "We were careful. 11 years of driving and then 18 years of waiting. And Curtis Webb had used the word we like. It was the most natural thing in the world." "He could have contacted me," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. At some point in 18 years, he could have found a way. He tried. 3 times in the first 4 years. Curtis's jaw shifted slightly. Each time Victor found out. The 3rd time you were 21. You had just started your firm. Victor made it clear that the next contact would result in consequences for you, specifically your business licenses, your contracts. A fraud allegation he'd had prepared and sitting in a drawer for exactly that contingency. He stopped. Your father decided that watching you build something from a distance was better than destroying it trying to get close. I thought about the box of architecture books I'd gone to collect that Tuesday in October. I thought about my mother's letter, with its careful, aching vagueness. I thought about 11 properties in a portfolio, and a man named Dr. Leonard Pruitt, who had signed a death certificate for a body that wasn't my father's. I thought about Victor in the dining room with Renee, my mother's name on a document she never signed, a pen moving across a line that would have transferred the last remaining thing my father had ever tried to protect. What changed, I said. Why now? Curtis took the Savannah exit before he answered. Because Victor has scheduled a board meeting for next Friday, he said. He's going to transfer the controlling interest in your father's company to a holding entity he and Renee own jointly. Once that transfer is complete, the chain of ownership is severed. No court will unwind it cleanly. He slowed for a traffic light at the bottom of the ramp. Your father has been waiting for the right moment for 18 years. This is the last one he's going to get. The light turned green, and he wanted to know, Curtis said quietly, whether you'd be willing to walk back into a room that was always yours. I didn't answer right away. I sat with my broken suitcase and my birthday card and the specific clarifying weight of everything I had just been told, and I watched the Georgia landscape move past the window, and I thought about a 6-year-old girl spinning in a leather chair, while her father stood at a window and held his ground. The moment you let someone rush you out of a room that's yours, you've already lost the room. I had been rushed out of a lot of rooms. I had let it happen because I thought I had no choice. Because I thought I was alone. Because I thought the person who had taught me how to hold my ground was buried in a cemetery in East Atlanta under a headstone with his name on it. He wasn't. And Victor had exactly 8 days left to enjoy the thing he'd stolen. The property outside Savannah was not what I expected. I don't know what I had been building in my mind during the 2-hour drive. Some version of hiding, I suppose. Something provisional and apologetic. A place that looked like a man who believed he didn't deserve better. A man who had spent 18 years in self-imposed exile had no business living anywhere beautiful. But the property was beautiful, not aggressively so, not the kind of beautiful that announces itself. A long gravel drive through a corridor of live oaks draped in Spanish moss. The trees so old and so deliberate, they felt less like landscaping, and more like a decision the land had made about itself a long time ago. A farmhouse at the end of the drive, white-painted brick-deep porch running the full width of the front 2 rocking chairs and a small table between them. The kind of house that had been built to last and then maintained by someone who understood that maintenance was itself a form of intention. Curtis parked at the end of the drive and turned off the engine. "He knows you're coming," he said. "I called ahead when you got in the car." I sat for a moment. My hands were in my lap. I noticed they were very still, which was not how I felt. It was simply what my body did when I needed to think a habit so old I couldn't remember acquiring it. 18 years. My father had been alive for 18 years while I sat in a church pew at his funeral and held my mother's hand and tried to understand how the world could keep moving when a person that central to it was suddenly gone. He had been alive while I failed my junior year and had to repeat 2 classes. Alive while I got into Georgia Tech on my 2nd application. Alive while I graduated and took a job I hated for 3 years to save enough money to start my own firm. Alive while my mother got sick and while she died, And while I stood at her graveside in the same cemetery where his empty casket was buried and understood for the first time what it meant to be completely alone. He had been alive for all of it. I got out of the car. The front door opened before I reached the porch steps. And there he was. Raymond Whitfield was 63 years old, and he looked like a man who had spent 18 years making peace with a decision that had never fully made peace with him. His hair was silver now, fully evenly silver, the kind that comes from time rather than stress, though I suspected there had been plenty of both. He was thinner than the photographs I'd carried in my memory, but he stood straight and his hands were at his sides, and he was looking at me with an expression I didn't have a word for then. And still don't entirely, though. It contained something that looked like relief, and something that looked like grief, and something that looked like a question he was afraid to ask out loud. I stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. We looked at each other for a moment that had no appropriate length. Then he said, "Aubrey," just my name. The way he'd said it my whole childhood, 2 syllables, no performance like the word itself, was enough. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that, not because crying would have been wrong, but because what I felt in that moment was not the kind of thing that comes out as tears. It was older than that. It was the specific ache of something that had been missing for so long. You'd restructured your entire life around the absence, and now the absence was gone, and you didn't yet know what shape you were without it. I walked up the steps, and I let my father put his arms around me, and I stood there in the particular silence of a Georgia morning outside Savannah, and I let myself understand that he was real. We sat on the porch for 3 hours. He told me everything. Not in the rushed, defensive way of someone who has been rehearsing an apology, in the slow, careful way of someone who has been rehearsing an account. Every decision, every trade-off, every moment when he had considered breaking cover, and the specific reason he had pulled back. He told me about Victor's first approach, a buyout offer $2019 on 2006 property values dressed up with language about partnership and growth. He told me about the documents he'd found afterward, the evidence that Victor had been moving money through the company into shell accounts for 2 years before the offer, positioning himself for a hostile acquisition if the friendly one failed. He told me about the conversation that changed everything, a phone call he wasn't supposed to hear a name mentioned alongside a timeline that gave him 72 hours to decide what kind of danger his family was in. He had chosen to disappear because he believed it was the only move that protected us and preserved the evidence. He had chosen Savannah because he had a trusted attorney there. A woman named Constance Jarvis, who had been holding documents in a sealed file for 18 years, waiting for exactly this moment. "What kind of documents?" I said. He looked at me, steadily. "The original articles of incorporation for Whitfield Capital Group. The shareholder agreement showing Victor's 20% stake and the conditions under which it could be dissolved. The deed transfers on all 11 properties. In your name, Aubrey, not mine. I had them restructured 6 months before everything happened, because I had already started to understand what Victor was planning." He paused, and Dr. Pruitt's original signed statement notarized, confirming that the body he identified was not mine and that he was coerced by Victor Carr into falsifying the death certificate. I was quiet for a long moment. Pruitt signed a statement. Pruitt got sick 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. He called Constance himself. My father turned his coffee cup in his hands. Some men, when they understand they're dying, decide they don't want to carry certain things with them. I thought about what that document meant in practical terms. I had spent 10 years as an architect. I understood load-bearing structures. I understood that a building stands or falls based on what's holding the weight at its foundation. Dr. Pruitt's statement was the foundation of everything. Without it, Victor was a man who had perhaps manipulated some paperwork. With it, Victor was a man who had faked a death, committed fraud across 18 years of property transfers, and built an empire on a foundation of deliberate criminal deception. With it, every transaction he had ever conducted under the authority of Raymond Whitfield's assumed death became challengeable, including the board meeting scheduled for next Friday. "I need to call my attorney," I said. My father nodded. He had already anticipated this. He slid a folder across the porch table, Constance Jarvis's contact information on top. And beneath it, a 12-page summary document she had prepared outlining the legal strategy she recommended. I opened the folder. I read the first page. Then I set it down and looked at my father. "You've been planning this," I said. "For 3 years," he said. "Since Pruitt called. I was waiting for Victor to overreach far enough that the timing would be clean." He looked out at the live oaks at the end of the drive. "When Curtis told me he'd gone after the house, your mother's house, I knew he'd gotten greedy enough. Greedy men always do eventually. They can't help it. They've been winning so long, they forget that winning isn't the same as being safe." I looked down at the folder in my hands. 12 pages, 18 years, 11 properties, 1 board meeting 8 days away. I thought about the broken suitcase still in Curtis's car. I thought about the sound it had made scraping across the driveway concrete that morning, that particular deliberate sound, like a small final humiliation wrapped up in luggage. I thought about Victor's face when he'd told me there were legal complications. The practiced calm of it, the signet ring turning on his finger. I closed the folder. "Tell me what you need me to do," I said. My father looked at me for a moment, and for the first time since I'd walked up those porch steps, that expression on his face shifted. The grief and the relief and the unasked question all moved to one side, and what replaced them was something simpler and much older. It was pride. "I need you to walk into a room," he said, "and remind some people whose name is on the building. I spent 5 days in Savannah. I want to be honest about what those 5 days were, because it would be easy to describe them only in terms of strategy, the calls with Constance Jarvis, the documents reviewed and organized, the legal timeline mapped out on a yellow legal pad on my father's porch table. All of that happened. But what also happened was that I sat across from my father at breakfast every morning and learned how he took his coffee now, black, no sugar, a habit he'd picked up in the years of simplifying, and that he had taught himself to cook during the long solitary stretches and was quietly excellent at it, and that he still read architecture journals, had been reading them for 18 years, had followed my firm's work through whatever digital channels he could access without surfacing his identity. He had a folder on me. Not surveillance, more like the kind of careful, aching attention a person pays to something they love from a distance and cannot touch. Articles. A printout of my firm's website from 3 years ago. A photograph someone had taken at an industry event in 2021 that had appeared in an Atlanta Business Chronicle piece about emerging designers. I was standing at the edge of the frame, half turned towards someone off camera, laughing at something I no longer remembered. He had printed it out and kept it in a folder with my name on it. I did not cry then either. But it was a closer thing. On the 3rd day, Constance Jarvis drove out from the city, and we sat at the porch table for 4 hours going through everything. She was 71 years old, small and precise, with reading glasses she wore on a chain. And a legal mind I recognized immediately as exceptional, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but becomes apparent through the quality of the questions it asks. She had been holding my father's documents for 18 years, with the patience of someone who understood that the right moment was worth waiting for. The strategy was clean. Clean in the way that good architecture is clean, not simple, but free of unnecessary complexity. Every element load-bearing, nothing decorative that wasn't also structural. Constance had already filed a petition in Chatham County to vacate the death certificate on the grounds of fraud, supported by Dr. Pruitt's notarized statement. The petition was sealed, pending the outcome of the board meeting. We needed Victor to proceed as if nothing had changed, needed him to be sitting in that room on Friday with every fraudulent transaction he'd ever made, resting on the assumption that Raymond Whitfield was dead. The moment the transfer was initiated, it would constitute the most recent in a chain of fraudulent acts. And it would be the one captured in real time on record in front of witnesses. The properties were already in my name. Had been for 18 years in documents Victor had never known existed. Every transfer Victor had conducted since my father's disappearance had been conducted under a false premise, which meant every transfer was challengeable. The 11 original properties, the development deals, the company's shares, the house on Cascade Road, all of it. I flew back to Atlanta on a Thursday morning. Curtis drove me to the airport and shook my hand at the departures entrance, with a formality that felt like the conclusion of something very long. I told him I would see him on Friday. He nodded once and got back in the car. Atlanta received me the way it always did, with heat and traffic, and the particular quality of light that bounced off the downtown glass towers in the late morning and made everything look simultaneously beautiful and combative. I went to my office. I sat at my desk. I looked at my phone. There were 14 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize, all from the previous 2 days. One voicemail. I played it. It was a man identifying himself as a representative of a firm called Hargrove and Associates, calling on behalf of their client regarding a professional conduct matter that had recently come to their attention, and that I might want to address proactively before it became a formal complaint. I played it twice. Then I looked up Hargrove and Associates. They didn't have a website. They didn't appear in the Georgia State Bar Directory. The phone number routed to a voicemail box that had never been set up. Victor. I put my phone face down on the desk and sat for a moment cataloging the move. Not a real legal threat. There was no case. No conduct to complain about, nothing I had done that could sustain even a frivolous complaint. This was noise. This was Victor creating the sound of pressure to see whether I would flinch, call him, try to negotiate. Show my hand in some way that told him I was rattled. I did not call him. What I did instead was call every contact I had in Atlanta's architectural and development community. Not to discuss Victor, not to explain anything, simply to confirm meetings and project conversations I had been letting slide during the previous weeks. I was visible. I was present. I was a woman who had a business to run and was running it. I gave Victor nothing to read in my behavior because my behavior was exactly what it had always been. But that evening, the call I hadn't expected came. It was from Dara Mitchell. Dara had been a friend, or what passed for a friend in professional circles, which meant we had lunch 3 or 4 times a year and genuinely enjoyed each other's company, and were honest with each other in the selective way. You're honest when you're both operating in the same competitive space. She was a senior partner at one of the larger development firms in the city, and we had been circling a potential collaboration for most of the year. She called, and there was a particular careful quality to her voice that told me before she said anything that she was calling, because she felt she owed it to me, which meant she was about to tell me something I wasn't going to like. "I got a call this morning," she said. "From Victor Carr." I kept my voice even. "What did he say?" "He said you'd been struggling, emotionally, since your mother. He said he'd tried to support you, but that your behavior had become," he used the word erratic. "He said he was concerned you might be taking on contracts you weren't positioned to complete, and that he felt it was his responsibility, as your stepfather, to make sure people in your network were aware." She paused. "He mentioned your firm specifically, Aubrey. He mentioned 2 projects by name, the 2 largest contracts I currently held." I sat with that for a moment. The specific calculation of it, not a frontal attack, but a lateral one, undermining the ground beneath my feet while appearing to speak from concern. It was well constructed. I could almost admire it if it hadn't been aimed at me. "Dara," I said. "I appreciate you telling me. Is it true, any of it?" "No." A beat. "I didn't think so." Another pause longer. "He also asked me to let him know if you reached out to me about anything unusual. He framed it as looking out for you. He had asked her to surveil me. He had called my professional network, named my active contracts, and asked people I trusted to report back to him. All of this in the 48 hours since Curtis had driven me away from Cascade Road. He was moving faster than I'd expected, or he was scared. I thought about that distinction for the rest of the evening. A man who is simply greedy moves at his own pace, consolidating methodically, unhurried. A man who is scared moves like this, lateral, fast-burning resources he'd normally conserve, making noise he'd normally avoid. Victor had spent 18 years being careful. The calls to my network, the fake law firm, the accelerated board meeting. None of it was careful. Something had changed. Something he hadn't anticipated had entered his calculation and shifted it. I thought about what Curtis had said in the car. "Your father has been waiting for the right moment for 18 years. This is the last one he's going to get." And then I thought about something else, about what it meant that Victor was moving this fast, this sloppily right now. It meant he knew the window was closing. It meant he had some awareness, however incomplete, that the ground beneath his own feet was less stable than it had been. It meant someone had made a mistake. I called Constance Jarvis at 9:15 that evening. "The petition," I said. "Is it still sealed?" A pause. "It should be. I'll verify first thing tomorrow." "Please." I looked out my office window at the Atlanta skyline, the lights of a city my father had built a piece of, and then been erased from. "And Constance, I think he knows something is coming. I don't know how much, but I think we should assume he's going to try to move the board meeting earlier." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "How much earlier?" I thought about the email I'd seen on Victor's dining room table. The note in the upper right corner. 4 words in his handwriting. "Transfer complete by Friday." "Tomorrow," I said. "I think he's going to try to do it tomorrow." The silence on the other end of the line lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Constance said, "I'll call the judge tonight." Constance called the judge at 9:47 that evening. I know the exact time because I was sitting at my office desk when she called me back. And I looked at my phone when it lit up and noted the time, the way you note small details when everything around you is moving too fast for comfort. 9:51. 4 minutes to reach a sitting judge at home on a Thursday evening and obtain an emergency order to preserve the sealed petition and issue a temporary injunction against any transfer of assets associated with Whitfield Capital Group, pending a hearing the following morning. 4 minutes. I thought about that afterward, about what it meant that Constance Jarvis had the kind of relationships that made 4 minutes possible. 18 years of patience had not been the only thing she'd been building. "The injunction will be served to Victor's attorneys by 7 a.m. She told me. "He'll know by 7:15. And the board meeting, scheduled for 10, will be there at 9:30. A pause. "Aubrey, get some sleep." I did not get much sleep. I lay in my apartment, a 2-bedroom in Inman Park. I'd been renting for 6 years. Nothing remarkable about it, except that every object in it was something I had chosen for myself, which had always felt important in a way I hadn't fully articulated until recently. And I looked at the ceiling and let my mind move through everything the way you walk a building before you sign off on it. Every room, every joint and seam, every place where the structure could fail if something had been miscalculated. The documents were real. Constance had verified every page over 18 years. Dr. Pruitt's statement was notarized, witnessed, and had been authenticated by a handwriting specialist 18 months ago in anticipation of exactly this moment. The property deeds in my name were registered in Chatham County under the corporate entity my father had established, a company called Meridian Architectural Holdings, LLC. A name I now understood had not been chosen randomly. The original shareholder agreement, showing Victor's 20% stake and the conditions of its dissolution, was clear and unambiguous on the question of fraud. If a partner was found to have engaged in fraudulent conduct affecting the company, their stake was forfeit. Not reduced, forfeit. 20% to zero, retroactive to the date the fraud began. I thought about Victor's signet ring. Gold heavy in emblem, he never explained. I had spent 20 years in proximity to that ring without ever asking what the emblem meant. I asked my father on the second day in Savannah, and he told me it was a crest Victor had designed himself, had it made by a jeweler in Buckhead, sometime in the early 2000s. A crest for a family that hadn't existed before him, built to look like something inherited. That was Victor's entire project, I understood now. Building the appearance of legitimacy so thoroughly that no one thought to check the foundation. I fell asleep sometime after 2. My alarm went off at 5:30. I wore a charcoal wool blazer and dark trousers and the simple gold earrings my mother had given me the year I opened my firm. I did my hair the way I always did. The twisted bun, thick coils at the temples, and I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a moment before I left. And I thought about what my father had said on the porch. Walk into a room and remind some people whose name is on the building. The building at 271 Peachtree Center Avenue was 40 stories of glass and steel that my father's company had developed in 2003, 3 years before he disappeared. It had been called Whitfield Tower at its opening. Victor had quietly renamed it Carr Whitfield Center sometime around 2015. Adding his own name to the front in a move so incremental that no one had publicly objected. The Whitfield name was still there. It was just no longer first. Curtis picked me up at 8:45. We drove without speaking for most of the way, which was how I preferred it. At a red light on Peachtree, he reached into the glove compartment and handed me a manila envelope without looking at me. "From your father," he said. I opened it. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a letter from Raymond Whitfield to the board of Whitfield Capital Group, written in my father's handwriting on paper. Recognized the heavy cream stock he'd always used for formal correspondence, the kind of paper that communicated before the words did that the person writing it understood the weight of what they were saying. The letter introduced himself as a living party, referenced the supporting legal documentation being filed simultaneously, and requested that the board suspend all pending transactions pending a full legal review. The second document was a 1-page summary of Dr. Pruitt's statement with the key passage highlighted in yellow. I, Leonard M. Pruitt, M.D., do hereby attest that on October 14, 2006, at the direction of Victor Emmanuel Carr, I falsified the official identification of remains in case number 2-006 ATL 4847, signing a death certificate for 1. Raymond Elijah Whitfield, knowing that the deceased individual was not Raymond Elijah Whitfield. I was compensated for this act in the amount of $40,000 transferred in 2 installments to an account in my wife's name. I make this statement freely without coercion and with full understanding of its legal implications. I read it twice. I folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. We pulled into the parking structure at 271 Peachtree at 9:22. Constance was waiting in the lobby with 2 associates, young, precise, carrying matching leather document cases with the quiet confidence of people who had prepared extensively and knew it. She looked at me when I came through the revolving door and gave me a single nod. The kind of nod that means everything is in place. The injunction was served at 7:03, she said, falling into step beside me. Victor's attorneys called our office at 7:11. They requested a 48-hour delay on the hearing. Did they get it? No. She allowed herself a small, dry smile. The judge was not sympathetic. We took the elevator to the 22nd floor. The building hummed around us, the particular hum of a large structure in full operation, the HVAC and the elevator cables, and the low vibration of dozens of simultaneous conversations happening in offices on every floor. I had always found that hum comforting, the sound of a building doing what it was designed to do. The boardroom was at the end of a long corridor, with floor-to-ceiling windows on the left side, the Atlanta skyline spread out beyond the glass in the clear October morning light. I had been in this room twice before, once as a child when my father brought me to the office on a Saturday and let me sit at the big table and pretend I was running a meeting, and once at 22 when I had come to ask Victor for a small investment in my firm, and he had listened politely and then told me that he didn't mix family and business. I had not understood the irony of that statement at the time. There were 9 board members. They were already seated when we arrived. 7 men and 2 women ranging in age from their late 40s to their mid-70s, dressed in the particular way of people who attend meetings in rooms like this, regularly enough that it no longer requires effort. Several of them looked up when we came in. One of the women, mid-50s, natural hair, a composed expression that shifted only slightly when she saw Constance sat up fractionally straighter. Victor was at the head of the table. He was wearing a dark navy suit and the gold signet ring, and he was in conversation with the man to his left when we entered. And he looked up when the door opened, and I watched his face in the half-second before his composure reassembled itself. In that half-second, I saw it clearly. Not fear exactly, something more specific than fear. The particular expression of a man who has built a very tall structure on a foundation he knew, was compromised, and has just heard somewhere below him the first sound of something giving way. Then the composure came back smooth and practiced, and he looked at me with the cool civility I had known my entire life. "Aubrey," he said, "this is a closed session." I walked to the opposite end of the table from where he was sitting and set the manila envelope down on the polished surface. "I know," I said. "I'll be brief." I opened the envelope. I placed my father's letter in the center of the table where everyone could see the letterhead. I placed Dr. Pruitt's statement beside it. And then I placed one final document, a certified copy of the deed to the 11 original Whitfield properties, registered in my name in Chatham County, bearing a date 18 years ago, and a notary seal that had been waiting in Constance Jarvis's file cabinet ever since. The room was very quiet. At the head of the table, Victor's right hand moved to his signet ring. And then from the doorway behind me came a voice that had not been heard in this building in 18 years. "Good morning," my father said. "I apologize for the delay." Victor's hand went still. The signet ring fell. It hit the polished table with a sound that was small and very final, and it rolled 3 inches and stopped, and no one in the room moved for a moment that had no appropriate length, and the Atlanta skyline held still behind the glass, and Raymond Elijah Whitfield walked into the room that had always been his. The first person to speak was the woman with the natural hair. Her name was Gloria Okafor. I learned this later. In the moment, I only knew her as the board member who had sat up straighter when Constance walked in, which I had filed away as potentially significant. She was 57, I would find out, a retired appellate judge who had joined the Whitfield Capital Board 6 years ago at Victor's invitation, which had seemed like a gesture of legitimacy at the time, but which I now understood was Victor's habit surrounding himself with people whose credentials would reflect well on him without their ever looking closely enough at what they were credentialing. Gloria Okafor looked at my father standing in the doorway of the boardroom and said very quietly, "Raymond." Not a question, a recognition. My father looked at her. "Gloria." He walked into the room and took the empty chair to my left, the one I'd not filled, had left deliberately open because Constance had told me to leave it open, and I'd not asked why until now. He sat down with the particular ease of a man returning to a chair he had sat in many times before, and he placed his hands flat on the table, and he looked at Victor. Victor had not moved. His right hand was still in the position it had been when the ring fell, slightly extended, fingers open like a man who had reached for something and found nothing there. His composure was intact on the surface. Beneath the surface, something was happening that his face was working hard to contain. "This is not legally permissible," he said. His voice was even. I noticed his attorney, a man in his 50s, seated against the wall behind him, not at the table, had gone very still. "Whatever documents have been presented, this proceeding is irregular, and I will not." "Mr. Carr." Constance set a bound document on the table and slid it toward Victor's attorney without looking at him. "The emergency injunction issued this morning by Judge Patricia Ann Holloway of the Fulton County Superior Court, suspending all pending asset transfers associated with Whitfield Capital Group. The petition to vacate the death certificate of Raymond Elijah Whitfield filed in Chatham County and currently before the court, and the supporting affidavit of Dr. Leonard M. Pruitt, authenticated and notarized." She paused. "Your client has been served. You received copies at 7:03 this morning." The attorney picked up the document. He opened it. He read the first page with the expression of a man who is hoping very hard that the next page will be better than this one. It was not better. "I want to be clear about what's in front of you," Constance said, addressing the board now moving around the table with a measured, unhurried pace that reminded me of the way my father had stood at that window when I was 6 years old. The calm of someone who knows the numbers. The documents presented today establish 3 material facts. First, that Raymond Whitfield is alive and was never legally deceased, meaning every action taken under the authority of his assumed death is subject to legal challenge. Second, that the 11 founding properties of Whitfield Capital Group were transferred into a separate holding entity in Aubrey Whitfield's name prior to Raymond Whitfield's disappearance, meaning they were never part of the estate Victor Carr administered. And every transaction conducted on the basis of that administration is fraudulent. Third, that the death certificate filed in October 2006 was falsified by Dr. Leonard Pruitt at the direction of Victor Carr, a fact attested to in a signed and authenticated statement that has been filed with the court. She stopped at the end of the table and looked at the board. "You are not required to take any action today. The court will address the legal questions. What you are required to do as fiduciaries of this organization is refrain from authorizing any transfer of assets until the legal proceedings are resolved. The injunction compels that in any case. But I want you to understand the substance of what's been presented, not just the procedural constraint." No one spoke for a moment. Then Gloria Okafor said, "Is there documentation of the property transfer to Aubrey Whitfield?" "On the table in front of you," Constance said. "Certified copies, registered deed, Chatham County, dated September 2006. Original on file with the court." Gloria picked up the document. She read it with the focused attention of someone who had spent decades evaluating exactly this kind of material. She turned to the second page, then the third. Then she set it down and looked at Victor with an expression I recognized from people who had believed something for a long time and were in the process of understanding that the belief had been constructed for them. "Victor," she said, "did you know Raymond was alive?" The room was very quiet. Victor looked at Gloria for a long moment. Then he looked at my father. Then he looked at me. And I watched him make a calculation, the kind you make when you understand that every exit has been closed. And the only remaining variable is how you choose to conduct yourself in the room where it ends. "I would like to speak with my attorney," he said. "Of course," Constance said pleasantly. "You have until the hearing tomorrow morning. Victor pushed his chair back and stood. He was still composed. I will give him that. He straightened his jacket with one hand, the habitual gesture of a man who maintained his presentation even when the presentation no longer served any purpose. He looked at the board without addressing anyone specifically, and then he walked toward the door with his attorney 2 steps behind him. He passed within 4 feet of where I was sitting. He did not look at me. He did not look at my father. He walked out of the room and the door closed behind him, and the room exhaled. My father sat very still for a moment. Then he reached across and placed his hand over mine on the table briefly, the way he used to when I was small. And he wanted me to know something without making a performance of it. Then he removed his hand and straightened in his chair and looked at the board. I owe each of you a full accounting, he said, of what happened 18 years ago and of what I've been working to document since. I'd like to do that now, if you're willing to hear it. But first, I want to acknowledge that you've been operating in good faith under circumstances that were designed to prevent you from knowing the truth. Whatever decisions were made in this room before today, I understand they were made without the information that would have changed them. He paused. I don't hold any of you responsible for what Victor did. I hold Victor responsible for what Victor did. Gloria Okafor looked at him for a long moment. Raymond, she said, you have the floor. He spoke for 40 minutes. I had heard most of it already in pieces on the porch in Savannah. But hearing it in this room was different. Hearing it in the room where the consequences lived, where the decisions had been made, and the documents signed, and the company steered in directions it was never meant to go. The board listened without interrupting. One of the men older, heavy-set a real estate developer named Charles Tatum, who had been on the board since the beginning, took notes on a yellow legal pad, with the focused energy of someone recalibrating everything they thought they knew about the past 2 decades. At the end, Gloria asked 3 questions. Precise procedural questions about the legal timeline and the expected duration of the court proceedings, and whether the company's operating licenses would be affected during the review period. Constance answered all 3. Then Gloria looked at me. Miss Whitfield, she said, given that the founding properties are in your name, what are your intentions regarding the company? It was the question I had been thinking about since the porch in Savannah. Since my father had told me about the 11 properties and the shareholder agreement and the 20-year arc of a plan that had been designed with me at its center. I had spent the 5 days in Savannah and the sleepless Thursday night and the early Friday morning thinking about what I wanted, which was a question I had not allowed myself to ask in full until recently, because wanting things that had been taken from you felt like a way of letting the taking define you. I thought about the 2-bedroom apartment in Inman Park with its carefully chosen objects. I thought about my firm and its 2 employees, and the contracts I'd built one careful project at a time. I thought about who I was when no one was watching, not the woman navigating Victor's maneuvering, not the daughter processing 18 years of loss, but the architect who looked at spaces and understood intuitively what they were designed to do and what they were failing to do, and how they could be made to serve the people inside them better. That was who I was. That was what I had built when everything else was taken. I intend to ensure the company is run properly, I said. I'll be taking the chair of the board. I'll be bringing in an independent CEO within 60 days. I paused. And I'll be renaming the building. Charles Tatum looked up from his legal pad. To what? I looked at my father. He was watching me with that expression again, the one I still didn't have a full word for. Pride, yes. But something else beneath it. Something that looked like watching a person become exactly who you always believed they would be, and finding that the belief after everything had been worth holding. Whitfield Tower, I said. What it was always called. The first domino fell at 2:17 that afternoon. I know because I was sitting in Constance's temporary office, a conference room on the 14th floor that her team had commandeered for the day, every surface covered in organized stacks of documents, when her associate knocked and came in with a printed email and set it on the table without a word. Constance read it. Then she slid it to me. It was from the Office of the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia. They had been monitoring the Chatham County petition filing. They wanted to schedule a call. I read it twice. Then I put it down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "How long have they been watching?" I asked. "Unclear," Constance said. "But federal attention at this speed suggests they had an existing file. Victor may have been on their radar before today." She picked up her phone. "This is good, Aubrey. This is very good." I understood intellectually that it was good. The part of me that had spent the morning in a boardroom watching a man I'd known my entire life walk out a door with his attorney was still processing what good meant in this context. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from the sustained weight of having been right about something terrible, from having carried the intuition that something was wrong for years before the evidence assembled itself into a shape other people could see. I was tired in that way. The specific tiredness of the end of something long. While Constance's team handled the federal inquiry, I called my firm. My office manager, a 28-year-old named Priya, who had worked with me for 3 years, and whose organizational precision I depended on, in the way you depend on a load-bearing wall, answered on the first ring. "Everything is fine," I said before she could ask. "I'll explain when I'm back. Is there anything urgent?" A pause. "Hargrove and Associates called again this morning." "They won't be calling again," I said. "If they do take a name and number and don't return it." Another pause. "Okay." Then carefully, "Aubrey, are you actually okay?" "Yes," I said, and I meant it in a way I hadn't meant anything in a long time. "I'll be in Monday morning." I hung up and sat for a moment with the particular quiet of a decision that has been made and cannot be unmade. Then I went to find my father. He was standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows at the end of the 14th floor corridor, looking out at the Atlanta skyline, with his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't hear me coming until I was beside him. And then he looked over without surprise, the way people look at things they've been hoping to see. We stood there for a while, without speaking. The city spread out below us, the highway interchange to the south, the Midtown Towers to the north, the irregular grid of streets and buildings, and the particular density of a city that had been rebuilding itself continuously for as long as anyone could remember. "I used to bring you up here," he said. "When you were small, you'd press your face against the glass." I remember. "You asked me once why we built buildings so tall when people only live on one floor at a time." I didn't remember that specifically, but it sounded exactly like something I would have asked. "What did you say?" "I said because the building isn't for the person on one floor. It's for everyone who will ever use it." He looked out at the skyline. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately." I understood what he meant. The company wasn't his the way a personal possession was his. It had been built for something larger than his ownership of it, for the employees who had given decades to it, for the tenants in the commercial properties, for the development corridors it had shaped in small ways for the city it had become a piece of. Victor had treated it as a personal possession, extracting and consolidating, watching it serve him rather than asking how he could serve it. That was the nature of what he'd done. Not just fraud in a legal sense, but a fundamental misunderstanding of what a thing is for. "The federal call is at 4, I said. "Constance wants you on it." He nodded. "Dad." The word came out more easily than I expected. I had been testing it privately for 5 days, trying it in my head, calibrating the weight of it after 18 years of not using it in the present tense. It fit differently than I remembered, not smaller, but changed the way a room you grew up in fits differently when you return to it as an adult. Still yours, just carrying more history than it used to. What happens to you legally? Pruitt's statement establishes the fraud on Victor's side, but the disappearance. Constance has been working on that for 3 years, he said. My conduct, the disappearance itself, falls into a complicated gray area. I wasn't a fugitive. No crime was charged against me. I made a choice to remove myself from a dangerous situation, and in doing so, I allowed a false record to stand, which is legally distinct from creating one. He paused. There will be proceedings. There will be things I have to answer for. I'm not expecting a clean exit from 18 years. He looked at me directly. But I'm not going back into hiding, Aubrey. Whatever the legal process looks like, I'm going to stand in it. I believed him. The federal call lasted 90 minutes. 2 agents and an assistant U.S. attorney who asked questions with the focused efficiency of people who had a large amount of existing information and were using this call to fill specific gaps rather than to orient themselves. They knew about the shell companies. They knew about 3 of the property transfers. They knew about Dr. Pruitt had known before the statement was filed, which confirmed Constance's read that there was a pre-existing file. What they did not know was the full chain, the original shareholder agreement. The pre-disappearance property transfers the complete architecture of what Victor had built. Constance walked them through it methodically. I listened and watched my father listen, and thought about the difference between a story ending and a story becoming something the law has to process, which is slower and less satisfying and more important. At 4:58, while we were still on the call, Constance's associate knocked and came in with another printed email. She read it. Her expression did not change in any dramatic way, but something in it settled, the particular settling of a person who has been waiting for a specific confirmation and has now received it. She passed it to me. It was from the Georgia Department of Banking and Finance. Victor's primary operating accounts. 4 accounts across 2 institutions, all associated with Carr Whitfield Holdings LLC, had been frozen pending a regulatory review. Effective 3:15 p.m. Victor's money was locked. The call ended at 5:10. Constance's team began the methodical process of packing up the conference room. I sat at the table for a few minutes after most people had filtered out in the particular quiet of a large effort in its concluding phase. My phone lit up, a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring. Then 30 seconds later, another call from the same number. I answered. Aubrey. Victor's voice. Controlled still. But underneath the control, something I had never heard in it before, something stripped like a surface with its finish sanded off. I think we should talk. I had been expecting this. Constance had told me it would likely come within 12 hours of the injunction being served. She had given me clear instructions, say nothing substantive. Refer everything to her office, and under no circumstances negotiate directly. I sat with the phone against my ear and listened to his breathing for a moment. There's nothing for us to talk about, Victor, I said. You have attorneys, so do I. I built something here. His voice tightened slightly, the first crack in the surface. Whatever you think about how it happened, I built something real. The company is healthy. The properties are performing. Everything I did to protect what your father abandoned. I thought about my father at the window, looking at the city. I thought about Curtis, sitting in a dark sedan outside a house for 22 minutes before sunrise, waiting for a woman with a broken suitcase. I thought about my mother's letter, with its careful, aching vagueness, and the birthday card at the bottom of a bedside drawer, and 4 words written in darker ink than the rest. I thought about what it cost to watch someone you loved build their life from a distance for 18 years because you believed that getting close would destroy what they were building. Victor had called that abandonment. He didn't abandon anything, I said. You took it. I ended the call. He called back twice. I didn't answer. At 6:45, Renee Hollins posted on Instagram for the last time. From the house on Cascade Road, a photograph of what I recognized as my mother's kitchen captioned with something about evening light and being home. By 7:30, according to Constance's associate who was monitoring public records, Renee's attorney had filed an emergency motion to formally separate her legal interests from Victor's in all pending proceedings. Renee had been in the house for 4 months. She had helped Victor sign documents over my mother's name. And the moment the accounts were frozen and the federal inquiry was public, she had called an attorney and begun constructing the argument that she was a victim of Victor's fraud as much as anyone. I read the filing summary and felt something that wasn't quite anger, more like the tired, clear-eyed recognition of a pattern completing itself. People like Renee didn't build things. They attached themselves to what other people built, and they called it partnership until the structure began to fail. And then they detached and found another structure. And they were very fluent in the language of victimhood because they had practiced it every time a structure failed before. She would be fine. She would find another Victor somewhere, or she would find a version of herself that didn't need one. Either way, she was no longer my problem. My father appeared in the doorway of the conference room at 7. "Curtis is downstairs," he said. "Are you ready?" I looked around the room, the empty conference table, the cleared surfaces, the city visible through the windows in the early evening dark. I thought about what this room had been 12 hours ago and what it was now, and the difference between those two things. Then I picked up my bag. My broken suitcase was still in Curtis's car. I'd been moving too fast all day to think about it. I would deal with it later. I would get a new one, eventually. I had bigger things to carry now. "Yes," I said. "Let's go." We rode the elevator down through 40 stories of a building that was about to get its name back. And I watched the floor numbers descend, and I thought about all the rooms I'd been rushed out of, and all the rooms I was about to walk into, and the difference finally between the two. The lobby was quiet at this hour. The security desk, the marble floors, the brushed steel lettering of the name above the entrance car, Whitfield Center, still for now. Curtis was waiting at the curb with the engine running. He looked up when we came through the revolving door. He looked at my father, and something moved across his face. Not surprise, because he had known this day was possible for 18 years, but something that looked like the specific relief of a man who has carried a long faithfulness and has finally been permitted to set it down. My father walked to the car and gripped Curtis's hand. Neither of them spoke. Some things don't need words. Some things have been waiting so long for their moment that when the moment arrives, the silence is the only language that fits. I got in the car. My father got in beside me. Curtis pulled away from the curb at a steady, unhurried speed, the way he always drove, like we had somewhere specific to be, and enough time to get there with dignity. Behind us, the building receded in the rear window. 40 stories of glass and steel lit up against the Atlanta night. Victor's name was still on the front of it, not for long. The hearing lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. Judge Patricia Ann Holloway was 64 years old and had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades in rooms where other people's crises are performing for their attention and have long since stopped being moved by the performance. She read everything. She asked precise questions. She gave Victor's attorneys the time they requested, and then gave Constance the time she requested, and then sat for 11 minutes in what I understood was not indecision, but evaluation, the methodical cataloging of a structure before you render judgment on whether it stands. She vacated the death certificate at 11:47 a.m. Raymond Elijah Whitfield was legally alive again at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning in October 18 years and 4 days after he had ceased to be. There was no dramatic sound in the courtroom when she read the order. No gasp, no applause. Constance made a note on her legal pad. My father sat with his hands folded on the table in front of him and closed his eyes for a moment, just a moment, and then opened them and sat straight again. I watched him do it and understood that 18 years of patience did not dissolve in a courtroom. It dissolved slowly, privately, in increments you couldn't see from the outside. Victor was not present. He had sent his attorneys with a stack of responsive filings that Judge Holloway read thoroughly and found unpersuasive. His primary argument that the property transfers and administrative actions taken under the assumed death certificate had been conducted in good faith was undermined completely by Dr. Pruitt's statement, which established that the false certificate had been created at Victor's direction. You cannot act in good faith on a document you caused to be falsified. Judge Holloway noted this in language that was dry and precise and absolute. The accounts remained frozen pending the federal inquiry. The asset transfers were suspended. The board of Whitfield Capital Group had voted in an emergency session the previous Saturday to engage an independent auditing firm to review 18 years of transactions. Gloria Okafor had called the vote. It passed 7-0. The two remaining members who had been most closely associated with Victor having tendered their resignations the morning after the boardroom confrontation. Those resignations had arrived in Constance's office within 36 hours of the meeting, fast enough to be driven by fear rather than principle, which I noted without judgment. People protect themselves. It is not admirable, but it is consistent, and consistency is at least something you can plan around. After the hearing, my father and I walked out of the courthouse into the October morning and stood on the steps for a moment without saying anything. The air was cool and bright, the particular clarity that Atlanta gets in October when the humidity finally relents and the sky goes a deep, unambiguous blue that makes the city look like a place someone has just cleaned. "What do you need?" I asked him. He thought about it. "Coffee," he said, "and probably a conversation with a very good immigration attorney about the question of where I've been residing for 18 years. I laughed. It surprised me, the laugh itself, the ease of it, the fact that my body was capable of it after the weight of the previous week. But there it was. My father looked at me when I laughed, and his expression did the thing it had been doing since the porch in Savannah, that complicated mixture of pride and grief and relief. And then he laughed too. And we stood on the courthouse steps in the October sun, and laughed in the way people laugh when the alternative would take too long. The calls started that afternoon. Patricia Osei called first. She had seen the court filing. It was public record now, and she wanted me to know that she had kept copies of everything from my mother's estate, every document from the 2 decades she had managed Eleanor Whitfield's legal affairs, and that she was available whenever I needed her. "I should have called you sooner," she said. When Victor's people contacted me about the change in counsel, I had a feeling I should have trusted it. "You couldn't have known," I said. "I could have asked more questions." A pause. "I'm asking them now. Whatever you need." I told her I would call her the following week. I meant it. Dara Mitchell called at 3. "I want to apologize," she said before I could speak. Not for the way I handled Victor's call. I should have called you immediately. I should have told you directly what he was doing instead of trying to navigate it carefully." "You did tell me," I said. "That same evening." It took me too long to decide to. I thought about that, about the particular courage it requires to tell someone the truth about what is being done to them, especially when the person doing it is powerful and the person receiving it is mid-fall. Dara had gotten there eventually. That mattered more than the delay. "The collaboration we were discussing," I said. "I'd like to revisit it." A pause, and then something in her voice shifted into the register of genuine relief. "So would I," she said. "Lunch next week?" "Yes." The call I hadn't anticipated came at 4:45. A man named Gerald Whitmore, who identified himself as having worked for Whitfield Capital Group for 23 years. He had been in the company from the early days, had known my father had stayed on after the disappearance because he had a family and couldn't afford to do otherwise, and had spent 2 decades doing his job carefully while managing what he described as a persistent and unverifiable sense that something was wrong. "I just wanted to call," he said. "I don't have anything specific to offer. I wanted you to know that some of us were still here, still doing the work the right way, even when—" He stopped. "Even when it wasn't easy." I thanked him and meant it at a depth that surprised me. He would be the first person I called when I began the process of building the new leadership structure, not because of this call, but because of the 23 years of doing it right when it wasn't easy. That was the kind of person you built around. Renee's Instagram was gone by Thursday. The account deleted entirely, not deactivated, deleted the particular erasure of someone who understands that the record is now a liability. I saw it noted in a message from Constance's associate who had been monitoring public-facing activity. I did not respond. Renee was a matter for the federal inquiry now, in whatever proportion her involvement warranted. That was not my work to do. My work on Thursday afternoon was to go to the house on Cascade Road. I had not been back since the morning Curtis had driven me away with the broken suitcase and the birthday card and the weight of everything I didn't yet know. I went in through the side door the way I always had, and I stood in the kitchen for a moment, the way I had stood that Tuesday in October when I'd heard Victor on the phone in my mother's study. The house was quiet. Victor had vacated the court order, had required it a condition Constance had specifically requested, and Judge Holloway had included without hesitation. His things were gone. There were rectangles on the walls where his art had hung lighter patches against the paint, like the outlines of things that hadn't been there long enough to matter. My mother's furniture was still there. Her kitchen table with the scratch on the left leg I'd made at 12 years old and always felt guilty about. The reading chair in the corner of the living room where she used to sit with her architecture journals. The bookshelf in the hallway with the collection she'd built over 40 years, the mid-century modernists, the Ghanaian designers tracked down at estate sales. The shelf of poetry she'd read every October since I could remember. I walked through the room slowly, the way I walked buildings, taking inventory, understanding what was there and what it was for and what it needed. In my mother's study, I sat at her desk and opened the top drawer and found still there, untouched, either overlooked or deliberately left, a small framed photograph. My parents at what I recognized as a company event early 2000s, my mother in a green dress. I remembered her wearing my father in a dark suit, with his hand at the small of her back, and both of them caught mid-laugh by whoever was holding the camera. I sat with that photograph for a long time. Then I called my father. "I'm at the house," I said. A pause. "How does it feel?" I looked around the study, the light coming through the window. My mother had always kept the curtains open on the bookshelf with its careful collection, the desk where she had written her letter, with the words she hadn't been allowed to say plainly. "It feels like hers," I said. "Still." "It is hers," he said. "It was always hers." I heard something in his voice when he said it, not the grief I expected, but something quieter, something that had been held for a very long time and was only now being set down. He had loved my mother. Whatever had happened to their marriage in the years before his disappearance, whatever complications existed in a story I only knew parts of, he had loved her and she had loved him. And Victor had taken 18 years from both of them that neither of them could get back. That was the part that didn't have a legal resolution. The court could vacate a death certificate and freeze accounts and issue injunctions. It could not return 18 years. It could not give my mother back the years she had spent not knowing, or give my father back the years he had spent knowing and staying away, or give me back the years I had spent grieving a man who was alive and rebuilding a life on the assumption of a loss that was a lie. Those years were gone. The fraud had been interrupted, and the documents were in order, and the building was getting its name back. But the years were gone. I thought about that on the drive home, about what you do with the part that can't be fixed, about whether healing requires resolution or whether it requires something harder than resolution, which is the ability to carry the unfixable thing alongside the fixed things without letting it define the weight of everything else. I didn't have the full answer. I suspected it was the kind of answer that arrives slowly over time, in small increments you don't notice until one day you look back and realize the weight has changed. But I was still here. My father was still here. The house was still here, and my mother's books were on the shelf. And the company was going to survive, and the building was going to get its name back. And somewhere in Savannah, a man named Curtis Webb was probably sitting on a porch having earned a very long rest. I got home at 7:30. I poured a glass of water and stood at my kitchen window, looking out at the street below the ordinary Thursday evening of it people walking dogs, a delivery truck idling at the corner, the lights of the apartment building across the street coming on one by one as the evening settled in. My phone buzzed. A text from my father. Constance says the federal inquiry has expanded. They have more than they told us. Victor is going to have a very difficult year. I read it twice. Then I put my phone down and finished my glass of water and thought about how a difficult year was a very mild way to describe the consequence of 18 years of fraud, and how the law was often a very mild instrument compared to the thing it was trying to address, and how mild or not it was enough. It was enough. I went to bed at 9:15. I slept without interruption for the first time in weeks, deep and dreamless, the sleep of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and has finally silently carefully put it down. 6 months later, I flew to Porto. Not for work. Not for a conference or a site visit or any of the professional reasons I had trained myself to justify travel with over the years. I went because I had wanted to go since I was 23 and had never allowed myself the time, and because my father had said something to me the week after the hearing that I'd been turning over ever since. He had said, "You spent 18 years building around a wound. Now build towards something." I had written it on a post-it note and stuck it to the edge of my monitor and looked at it every morning for 6 months. At some point, it had stopped being a reminder and started being a direction. Porto in April was cool and luminous, the light off the Douro River hitting the azulejo tiles of the old buildings at an angle that made everything look both ancient and immediate. I walked for 3 days without an agenda through the Ribeira Quarter, up the steep streets of the Cherofeta neighborhood, across the Dom Luis Bridge at dusk, with the city spreading in both directions, and the river below, going gold in the last of the afternoon light. I ate at small restaurants, where I didn't know anyone, and no one knew me. And the only thing required of me was to be present and pay attention. I took photographs, not for work, not with the professional eye that cataloged load-bearing elements and evaluated spatial flow. Just photographs of things I found beautiful. A blue-painted door. An old woman tending a window box 3 floors up. The shadow a wrought iron railing threw across a whitewashed wall at 11 in the morning. I had not done anything purely for beauty in a long time. On the second evening, I called my father from a cafe on a side street in Bonfim, the small table in front of me holding an espresso I was only halfway through, and a notebook I had been writing in, not professional notes, just thinking on paper, which was something I had done as a teenager and stopped somewhere in the years of building a life that required all its resources for structural purposes. He answered on the third ring. "How is it?" he asked. "Beautiful," I said. "Genuinely beautiful." He was quiet for a moment, in the way he went quiet when something pleased him, but he didn't want to make too much of it. "Good," he said. "That's good." We talked for 40 minutes. He told me about the independent CEO search, a woman named Dr. Adaize Nwosu. a Nigerian-American business executive with 20 years in commercial real estate development, who had come through the search process with a clarity of vision for the company that the board had responded to unanimously. He told me that Gloria Okafor had agreed to stay on as lead independent director, which I was glad about. He told me that Gerald Whitmore had been promoted to VP of Operations, which I was gladder about. He told me that his conversation with the immigration attorney had resolved more cleanly than expected. The disappearance legally documented as a response to credible threat rather than flight from criminal liability had placed him in a complicated but navigable position. There would be ongoing proceedings. There would be things to address. But he was in Atlanta now, in an apartment in Midtown he had chosen for the view of the skyline. And he was not going anywhere. Curtis drove me to look at it, he said. Gave me his full assessment of the neighborhood. What was his assessment? He said it was acceptable. A pause. From Curtis, that's effusive. I laughed. Outside the cafe window, the Porto evening was assembling itself. People finishing work, the streets filling the particular quality of a city in the hour between afternoon and night, when it briefly belongs to everyone equally. I thought about Atlanta the same way sometimes. The city my father had built a piece of and been erased from, and was now building himself back into one legal document and one conversation and one apartment with a view at a time. The city I had built a piece of myself smaller and without the resources he'd had, and had nearly lost to a man who understood that reputation was a structure you could damage from the outside without ever entering the building. Whitfield Tower had been rededicated in February. A small ceremony the board, a few longtime employees, my father and Curtis and Constance and me. No press by choice. The lettering above the entrance had been changed back in a single afternoon by a facilities crew who had been, according to Gerald Whitmore, noticeably cheerful about the assignment. I had stood on the sidewalk and watched the old letters come down and the right ones go up, and felt something settle in me that I didn't have a precise word for. Not triumph. Triumph is loud and pointed outward. This was quieter. More like the feeling of a room returning to its correct proportions after something that didn't belong had been removed from it. Victor's trial was scheduled for the fall. The federal indictment had come down in January: wire fraud, money laundering, falsification of public records, obstruction. 11 counts. His attorneys had filed 3 motions to delay and had 2 of them granted, which Constance said was expected and not concerning. The evidence was extensive. The timeline was clear. The outcome in her assessment was not in serious doubt. Renee had cooperated with the federal inquiry in exchange for a reduced exposure. Her cooperation had contributed 3 additional counts to Victor's indictment. I had no feelings about Renee that I spent much time attending to. She had made her calculations, and she was living with them, which was its own kind of sentence. The house on Cascade Road was mine. I had spent 2 weekends there since the hearing, not moving in. Not making decisions, just being in it. Relearning its proportions. Understanding what it needed and what I needed from it before I decided what it would become. There was no rush. The house had been waiting for a long time. It could wait a little longer for me to be ready. My firm had grown. Not explosively. I was not interested in explosion, had never been interested in building faster than I could build well. But Dara's collaboration had come through a mixed-use development on the west side of Atlanta that was the largest project I had ever taken on. And I had hired 2 additional architects and a project manager. And the office no longer felt like something I was holding together through sustained personal effort. It felt like something that had learned to stand on its own. I finished the espresso and closed the notebook and sat for a while watching the Porto street outside the window. A couple walked past arguing about something in rapid Portuguese, too fast for me to follow. A boy on a bicycle wove between pedestrians with the confident imprecision of someone who had been doing it since before he understood it was dangerous. An old man at the cafe table to my left was reading a newspaper so thoroughly that the rest of the world appeared to have ceased to exist for him. I thought about what I would have said to myself at 16, sitting in a church pew at my father's funeral holding my mother's hand, and trying to understand how the world could keep moving. I would have said it does keep moving. That's not a betrayal. That's the only way through. I would have said the people who take things from you are counting on you to stay small from grief. The best answer to that is to refuse. I would have said you are going to build something. It is going to be yours in a way that nothing can be taken from you, because it will be made of what you actually are, not what you were given. I would have said your father is alive, but I hadn't known that at 16. I had known only the grief and the absence and the slow, effortful work of building a life around both. And I had done it imperfectly at cost, with the specific limitations of a person who doesn't know what they're missing until it's returned to them. I had done it anyway. I thought that deserved some acknowledgement. Not pride, exactly. More like the clear-eyed recognition that survival under difficult conditions is itself a form of competence, and that the version of me who had spent 18 years building without knowing the full truth was not lesser than the version who knew. She was the foundation the rest of it rested on. I was not going to spend the next 18 years being angry about the previous 18. Victor would face what he had built. The law would do what the law does, slowly, imperfectly, consequentially. My father and I would have the years we had, which were not the years we'd lost, but were the years in front of us, and they were real, and they were ours. I paid for the espresso and walked out into the Porto evening. The Douro was 4 blocks away. I walked to it and stood at the embankment and watched the water move. In the last of the light, the old city behind me, the bridge downstream with its doubled arch reflected in the river. Boats moved slowly on the water. Somewhere behind me, a street musician was playing something on a guitar that I didn't recognize, but that was exactly right. For the moment, Unshowy genuinely felt the kind of music that doesn't demand your attention, but rewards it when you give it. I stood there for a long time. When I finally turned back toward the city, I thought about the photograph I'd found in my mother's study. My parents at that company event caught mid-laugh my mother in the green dress. It was on my desk at home now, in a new frame I'd chosen. Next to it was a photograph I had taken on the porch in Savannah the morning of the second day, my father with his coffee cup looking out at the live oaks, unaware I was taking it. And next to that was a photograph from the February rededication ceremony. The 3 of us, my father, Curtis, and me, standing in front of Whitfield Tower, with the new lettering behind us, not posing. Just standing there in the ordinary way of people who have somewhere to be and are not in a hurry. A frame on a desk is such a small thing. But after 18 years of keeping a single photograph in my wallet, because it was the only one I had a photograph I had looked at, so many times I had memorized every detail rather than actually seeing it anymore. 3 frames on a desk felt like something I was still learning to contain. I walked back through the Porto streets toward my hotel, the evening warm around me. The city easy and unhurried, not requiring anything from me that I wasn't ready to give. Tomorrow I was flying home. There was work to do. There was always work to do. There was a building with my family's name on it, and a company learning to be what it was built to be, and a house on Cascade Road waiting for me to decide what came next. And a father I was still figuring out how to know as an adult rather than as a memory. There was a life that was mine in a way it had never quite been before. Not because the circumstances had changed, though they had, but because I finally understood whose hands it was in, mine. It had always been mine. I had just needed to stop letting other people tell me otherwise. There's something they don't tell you about betrayal. They tell you it hurts, you already know that. They tell you to heal, to move forward, to not let it define you. What they don't tell you is that the most dangerous part of betrayal isn't what it does to your circumstances. It's what it does to your belief in your own right to take up space. Aubrey lost 18 years to a lie. But the lie didn't just take her father. It taught her slowly and systematically to expect loss, to build small, to stay quiet, to accept the rooms she was given because she didn't know she was owed more. If you've been there, if someone has spent years making you feel like your instincts are wrong, your needs are too much, your presence is conditional, I want you to hear this. The smallness is not yours. It was put on you by someone who needed you small to keep themselves standing. That's not a reflection of what you're worth. It's a reflection of how much they feared what you would become if you knew. You don't need a courtroom to reclaim what's yours. You don't need a father who reappears, or a Curtis Webb waiting at the curb, or documents held in a sealed file for 18 years. What you need is the decision the one Aubrey made on the end of that driveway when she looked back at the house once and then kept walking. Not because she had a plan, but because something in her knew that walking forward even broken was better than waiting to be let back in. The room was always yours. If this story found you today, I don't think it was an accident. Drop your time and your country in the comments and tell me, what is the room you're ready to walk back into? If this channel has ever given you something worth holding on to, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. We'll see you in the next one.